Optimism isn't sunshine and rainbows. It's fixing things, changing the way we fix things. It's running the world on smarter energy. Because if optimism never stops, then change can't either. GE Vernova, the energy of change.
The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
The country would rather not have to pay $100,000, but they'd rather, how do you do that? You hire Americans. So there's an incentive to hire Americans. But there may be instances where it's better off doing it through expertise or whatever it may be. But they're both unbelievable, whether it's a gold card or anything else that we talked about today.
What do Tesla's Elon Musk, Google's Sundar Pichai, and Microsoft's Satya Nadella have in common? They're all titans of technology. They all employ hundreds of thousands of people and enjoy eye-watering salaries, but they have also benefited from a document known as the H-1B visa. But at the weekend, US President Donald Trump imposed a $100,000 fee on these applications, which will make it harder and certainly more expensive for these tech giants to hire the best and brightest minds in the world. But more importantly, the tightening of this immigration is rubbing up against the agenda of the tech bros in Silicon Valley. They have a completely conflicting agenda. How will this fight play out? What will tech giants do if they can't hire the best minds? And can other countries benefit from a US clampdown? All of this and more in this week's Viewsroom. It's Amy.
And it's Jonathan, and it's the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that delves into the knottiest issues in corporate finance, business, and economics with a crack team of Breakingviews columnists. So we had a pretty chaotic weekend. At first, when the news came out, there was total confusion as to whether this was a $100,000 upfront fee for H-1B visas, whether this was an annual fee, whether folks would need to apply just to continue their kind of immigration status here in the United States. We had stories of folks like cramming onto planes last minute to get back into the country before this thing went into effect. And now we have like a few more of these details ironed out, but this seems like we're still kind of in the shock and awe period following what is basically, like you kind of put it, this weird like interfactional squabble within the Republican coalition, right?
It's true. And I have to say, when I watched it at the weekend, I wondered to myself, why on earth would you not say, in 6 months' time, we're going to introduce this reform to allow companies to kind of gather themselves and allow the workers to understand exactly what's expected of them. And as you said, I think one of the most interesting things is that there is this sort of like anti-immigrant faction of the Trump White House, right? So the faction of his White House that really just want, massive crackdowns on immigration of all kinds, whether it's the top tech minds or whether it's people illegally coming over the border. But I wonder, Jonathan, is there like a counter to this? Is there like a case to be made that these H-1B visas were being overused, that they were undercutting local workers, and that, that basically also the companies were sort of using them to keep these very like bright-minded people in situ, that they couldn't move to their competitors because they were like tied to a visa to their company?
Yeah, I mean, to scene set, let's be clear, there is a very large immigration crackdown happening in the United States, and this piece of it just happens to affect, like you say, the best and brightest and the largest companies in the world, and that's why there's such a firestorm over it. There are right now, law enforcement agencies that are doing street sweeps in major cities that are unlike anything we've ever really seen in the United States before. That is, frankly, very much outside the norm of how immigration policing usually works. And that is something that continues apace and, frankly, has raised very little of this kind of agita among the Republican coalition. All of a sudden, everybody cares when it's something that affects the tech giants. Like you say, there has been a long-running argument about, there is a composition of H-1B visas. They are largely towards kind of IT industries that these tend to get used. There are a few large contractors that show up in government data as like by far the largest users of these things. And that tends to breed this distrust over what is happening and what has become the kind of standard path for bright young minds looking for a lucrative career. That used to be, I mean, it still is, but, banking, private equity, etc. Coding now is kind of one of those things that, like, again, bright young people decide they're going to go into. And as that job market weakens, I think you see a lot of really, really high tensions flaming around that. Of course, that also creates a lot of challenges for Trump's backers, but fortunately, we can draw on the global expertise of Breakingviews for this week's episode. We're straddling 3 time zones this week. Una Galani is coming to us from Hong Kong and has been looking at what the change will mean for the many Indian workers who rely on these visas. And Rob Siren in New York can talk to us about what it means for the technology giants in the United States. Rob, Una, you are very welcome to the Viewsroom.
Nice to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Una, you wrote a really interesting view on the change to these visas. But before we get into that, can we just talk our listeners through the history of the H-1B, who uses them, and, kind of like whether this executive order just effectively came out of the dark and was totally unexpected?
Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to start with that last point because I find it so controversial. It's like, this is not a jolt out of the blue, and anybody who says it is lying, or it's completely misleading. Actually, Jamie Dimon gave an interview to the Indian media, I think it was, just this week, and he's a CEO of JP Morgan, and he said the visa fee is a jolt out of the blue, and his bank is one of the top 10 users of these visas. But I completely disagree with him because successive US administrations have constantly sort of stirred the pot on this issue, and this is exactly why India's largest IT firm, Tata Consultancy Services, it's the second largest user of these visas. That's exactly why they've heavily trimmed their dependency on these since the pandemic. I mean, after Amazon, TCS, is the second biggest user. So that shows you something. I mean, to answer your question on where these visas came from, how they came about, I mean, look, the US has for decades and decades and decades been thinking about what is the right way to bring highly skilled foreign workers into the country. But these specific visas were introduced in the 90s under President George Bush. And as you said, quite rightly, they were designed to be of a temporary nature to bring highly skilled, talented workers into the country. But today, when we think of H-1B visas, we think of techies, and we primarily think of Indians, because Indians are 71% of the beneficiaries of these visas, I think, followed by the Chinese. But actually, and I actually learned this really this week because I wasn't familiar with this either. This visa program has actually been used for other things as well, for doctors, for scientists, for patrons of the art. So, it had a kind of broader context to it. But the other thing that people need to understand about this visa is that the caps and the fees have moved around over the years. But there has always been this tension, right? This tension that you and Amy were talking about at the beginning, like the tension between the need to bring talent into the US so the US can create the companies that make the US exceptional, and the need to protect the domestic workforce. And it is absolutely no secret that a number of US companies and global companies have used these visas to hire talent at lower salaries than they would need to pay Americans. And that is also just well understood. Every good thing can have its flaws. And I think that's kind of where we are with this. So I think this tension is getting fiercer, and it's come to a head under Trump because of his America First agenda and the Make America Great Again sort of factions. But I think there's also a lesser appreciated point here that was laid out in the executive order. And, some people never read the executive orders, right? But actually it makes quite a good argument, which is that unemployment among STEM graduates in the US, STEM is these science, technology, engineering, mathematics graduates, the kind of people who are like perfect at building your next AI, cloud, something. Unemployment amount among this cohort is actually higher, or has been at points this year, higher than the overall unemployment rate in the US. And that is something that the administration is also perhaps trying to address here.
So, Rob, if I could bring you in here, because I think Una's made some really interesting points, but I'm sort of curious. I mean, none of these companies that Una has mentioned are short of money. So can they just recruit domestically? Can they pay these visas? Like, what would you imagine they're going to do in this situation?
I mean, it's short-term disruptive, but the companies made it through the pandemic and everything worked out pretty well. I mean, they actually grew substantially during the pandemic. So if you think about it more broadly, I mean, do these workers have to be in the United States? Probably not. especially over the near term. So it's more a matter of okay, maybe they will they'll use other visas, maybe they'll hire domestic workers, maybe they'll have workers working in Toronto, or maybe they'll have workers working in India. They'll just adjust their employment patterns. I think the more harmful effects are on company formation in the United States, because if you think about all the companies that have been founded by immigrants, it's like 20% of the S&P. And if you look at what's happening now, like among the AI companies, OpenAI, Perplexity, Anthropic, they all have immigrant co-founders. And Silicon Valley is definitely a place where people who are young and ambitious come to work. And one of the ways they come here is through H-1Bs, as you started off the conversation. And it founding a company online, sure, it can work, but it doesn't work quite as well as if you're in the office with someone all the time. And I think that will have an effect over it. So will it affect Microsoft? Sure, it'll be disruptive. Will it affect Tata? Of course. But it's more the new companies. And the other area is, I think it was you that said that it's not just people in tech companies. A lot of doctors come here on H-1Bs and other forms of student visa. So in North Dakota, for example, 5% of the GPs are here on H-1Bs. So in rural areas, it'll be harder to find a doctor. So it's more of those type of effects, and it's more lingering effects rather than the short, sudden shot to technology.
I want to lean on one point there because I think, Rob, you and I share the similar reflection of maybe being a little too online and following kind of what the discourse has been among like this right-wing political coalition leading up to this. And I think in that interregnum period after the election, before the inauguration, you saw a really big break between, Elon Musk and various other tech titans who had kind of really thrown their lot in with Donald Trump, and this kind of grassroots, really hardline anti-immigration part of the base. And like you say, there are all these kind of little weird niche areas around doctors in North Dakota or what have you. But the balance of the program, right, goes towards workers in the IT industry. As Una was saying, there is higher unemployment, or has been higher unemployment among STEM grads. And it feels like the oldest political story there is, a political group that assumes it will be upwardly mobile, is well-educated, sees their ambitions frustrated, and kind of picks on a thing to kind of latch their frustration to. And just kind of wondering, because the executive order is structured in such a way that it feels like it can be kind of pushed around to essentially just work for that political end, right? To really target the tech industry, as opposed to, this is going to be a blanket thing and they're not going to be able to suddenly backpedal and go oh my God, there are no doctors in rural hospitals anymore. Or am I maybe being a bit naive there?
I think what's really interesting about this executive order is it kind of lacks conviction in a way that some of other Trump's executive orders haven't, in the sense that there's a lot of an off-ramp and there's a lot of exemptions. There is a lot of so for example, this policy, the US is not going to run out of doctors because of this program, right? So firstly, you can apply for an exemption and the Secretary of the Homeland Department of Security can grant you an exemption. The program only lasts for 12 months and it will only extend if it is deliberately extended. And, this only applies to net new additions, right? So I think that says something about Trump's own views on this program, on this visa program, which have basically flip-flopped it around, right? So at some points he sides with his tech advisors who are very pro H-1B visas, and then at other times he sides with his mega base, and so that's all kind of, that hesitancy and that uncertainty is all wrapped up in this policy, which I think provides plenty of wiggle room for both companies and doctors and hospitals to get what they need in the short term. The real danger is, exactly as Rob said earlier, is that what will happen to company formation? The bigger question is what will happen if you curb talent migration to the US, not just over 1 year or 2 years, but over 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? The US has been great because it thrives on a mixture of local and foreign talent. And if you don't have that, then where are you?
I mean, there's also a bit of a New York Times article bias here in that this affects all the rich, educated people. So rich, educated people like to read about rich, educated people. But, there are lots of different forms of ways that people come to the United States, student visas, green cards, other forms of things. And those are all being cut back. And so it's a matter of dynamism, if you want to call it that, in the United States. And this is just the one that everyone's latched onto because it affects these companies and it affects people that they probably know. But you have to put it in the broader context, and that's a more, all of these forces are affecting the United States economy.
So, Una, I'm sort of curious, right? If you are one of these Indian workers or any of these like top minds that use these types of visas, and it looks like the US is just not really an option anymore, or at least a difficult option for you, where else would these types of people go to? Is there even a comparison? Because I know that like most countries, I had a quick look at this week, most countries have some version of the H-1B visa where they try and get, even though they might have a limit on other immigration, they say, well, actually, if you are this type of person, you can get a visa here. So Germany, UK, Netherlands, I would imagine, I mean, China's the second largest economy in the world. That could also be an option to go and work in those companies. But what I sort of thought was that if you are one of these people, you want to work in the biggest company because you want to be the future CEO of Microsoft. That's your ambition. And there's very few places that can even, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, nothing replaces the American dream, right? But the American dream and perceptions of the American dream are also souring. And just because you don't have to work in America to work for an American company. I mean, overall, I think professional Indians or Chinese who really want to live and work overseas will find a way to get to a rich country if they want to. Canada, Australia, Dubai, Singapore. There are many places. A lot of people in India, actually, this is sort of quiet on the down low, will be cheering too at the moment. And they are cheering because, a lot of people are tired of seeing the best and brightest Indians go overseas to run these American tech firms. Now, that's obviously their prerogative, and they've done very well. But India as well needs to create tech companies. They don't have their own large language model in AI. That India's behind despite being a big country of techie. So, I think there'll be some hope that there'll be a kind of reverse brain drain as well. But, ultimately, like, these companies will need to staff these roles, and if they can't do it in the US, then they may have to do that elsewhere, and people will follow the opportunities.
Yeah, and I mean, to that point, Rob, I know you and I have discussed a lot. There's a sort of chain of policy decisions that is affecting US international competitiveness, right? Whether that's funding for leading edge biotechnology startups, whether that's the immigration issue, whether that's a bunch of different things. Does that strike you as a sort of coalitional deal breaker between tech and the Trump presidency? Or is like H-1B sort of a marginal thing on top of everything?
It's not a deal breaker. I mean, if you look at the actual where the leaders of Silicon Valley are, a lot of them are big Trump supporters and among the VCs. It's different if you look at more science-based as opposed to engineering. If you look at the medical space, they tend to be a bit more skeptical. And that's because, again, if you broaden the conversation out besides just immigration, or looking at H-1B visas, if you look at science and tech funding, for example, basic research, the United States is a huge, huge chunk of the world's spending on basic research, which, eventually leads to medicines, and even further down the line leads to computing advances. And so Silicon Valley is built on that, but it won't affect that immediately. But if you cut these programs back, like the Trump administration is, it's very hard to replace them. You couldn't just, if you took every American scientist and had them go overseas, there simply aren't spaces for them. Even if you doubled and tripled everything overseas, there's just not space for them. So you can't just destroy this and say, okay, well, they'll find some place overseas. It just won't happen. So this, again, if you take a look at the whole of what everything the administration is doing, it's very harmful both for United States engineering and science, and it's going to slow down the world's advances in engineering and science. It might be advantageous to India or other places. I mean, America's benefited from taking the cream of the crop from everywhere in the world, But if the United States wants to score an own goal, everyone's going to hurt, but will hurt most of all, probably.
So there's another kind of element to this. And actually, when listening to you, I kind of thought this seemed like a test, right? As in like an experiment, if you will, that you do it for 12 months, you see what happens, you see what the backlash is. But at the same time, this is a revenue generator, right? The hope in some ways is that these companies will pay for these visas, right? They'll pay the US government $100,000 per person they want to hire. And maybe they can't find them domestically initially anyway. But I was just sort of curious, what's your thoughts on it being a revenue generator?
Look, I think that it's this $100,000 over an employee's 3 to 5 to 6 year term is not a lot of money. 3 years, that's like 5 years, $20,000 a year. That's kind of the cost of doing business for these companies. It's not going to move the needle. Even if JP Morgan paid $100,000 for all the H-1B visa holders they have today, it would be less than 0.4% of their net profit, the equivalent of that, right? So, this is affordable. To the extent it's a revenue generator for the US, I don't think that's why you do this. There have been certain initiatives that have been rolled out, and I haven't seen really what the US has said they'll put these proceeds into, but other types of policies coming out of the US, particularly ones that might attack India's services exports, IT services exports to the US, have floated ideas such as putting the proceeds of taxes into a fund that will then train the next generation of scientists or whatever. But I don't think this is enough money to move the needle.
Yeah, no, and famously, such training funds always work and always achieve their objectives. But that seems like as good a place as any to wrap it. Una, Rob, thank you so much for joining us on the Viewsroom.
Great to be here.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Cheryl Pena in New York and Gregory Garner in Toronto. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune into our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. We have a new email address where you can send us feedback, which is breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day on breakingviews.com and reuters.com.